Hey, so I'm quite new to Flutter and I'm excited to see what's possible with the framework, whether it's worth investigating and much more. As I'm investigating Flutter, I'm writing down the things I'm learning and of course, I'd love your feedback. The thing that I want to show you today is of course the provider and block pattern in hopefully 5 minutes. It might take a little bit longer, but nonetheless you have an article version of this video which you can check out over at developer.school. So with that very quick intro, you may have heard of a few different state management terminologies and tools and techniques such as the provider, block, MobX, Redux, RxDart, scoped model, inherited widget, and so many more. We're going to be looking at the block pattern and the provider library at this point, and we're going to start off with a brand new Flutter project. So let's run the following: Flutter create and then the name of your project, and then cd into that project. So let's hit enter on this. Once again, you can find all of the code inside of the article over at developer.school. Looks like I need to update my version of Flutter. Hopefully everything will be fine on this machine for now. So thankfully the creation of the Flutter project doesn't take long. I found that most times it takes at most a minute to get up and running with a new Flutter project. Once you've CD'd into that, we can run code and then of course this will open up inside of VS Code. Then just so we're all on the same page, I've got the Flutter extension installed and I'm going to hit start debugging, and that's going to allow us to preview with Dart and Flutter. I'm going to preview this on the iOS simulator, but you of course can use any simulator that you want. This is now going to open the iPhone XR for me, so this one might take a few minutes, so I'll skip until this is finished. Okay, so if you've seen a Flutter project before, you most likely have seen this screen. This is a counter and it allows us to see how many times we've pushed a button. Not that interesting, but we're going to build the same thing using the block pattern. So what we need is to head over to the pubspec.yaml, and inside of the dependencies, we want to add something called provider. Now I'm going to leave this out here as far as the version number is concerned, so just hit save and this will get the latest version of provider. It's recommended, if you want the same experience for everyone on your team of course, to have a particular version number that you selected, but for the purposes of our tutorial we'll simply leave that blank. Now let's head over to lib and we'll make a new folder called blocks, and inside of the blocks folder we'll have a counter_block.dart. We'll import the package material from Flutter, and we'll have a class equal to the counter block, which extends something called change notifier. We'll have a look at that in a moment, but for now we'll simply make an int underscore counter equals 0. That's going to be the current state of our counter. We'll have an int get counter, and that's going to use a lambda function here to return the current version of counter, the current value rather, and then we'll have a setter called counter, which will have an int equal to a value, and we'll set the counter equal to the value, and then we'll say notify listeners. So what exactly are we doing here? Well, effectively, we have a counter state, and that's going to be equal to 0. We've exposed a getter for this counter and a way to set a new value for this counter. Once the value has been setted, we are then going to call this notify listeners function, and this calls all the registered listeners. So when our counter value changes, anything that's listening to the value of this counter will of course be updated with the new value. Let's, inside of lib, make a new folder called pages, and inside of pages we'll have a counter.dart. We'll make ourselves a brand new class called counterPage, and that will extend a stateless widget. We'll need to import material.dart, and then at the same time our stateless widget will need a build function. We can hit command dot on that, and that will of course give us a build function. We'll return ourselves a new scaffold, and that scaffold will have a body equal to a new container, and the container will have a child of centered text, and inside of the centered text we want to have the value of our counter. So how do we get the value of our counter? Well, above our scaffold here, we want to have a final counter block, and we'll need to import the counter block. And that's going to be called counter block. So that's of type. This is not going to change. And we want to set that equal to provider dot of, and we'll also need to import provider from the provider package that we installed earlier on. That's going to be of type counter block, and we'll need to pass in the build context. We can then, inside of the text, say we want to call the counter block dot counter dot toString. So right now we won't see anything, and the reason that we won't see anything at this point is because we haven't actually wired up this counter page. But for now, I'd like to sort of get your interest on this line. It's line 8 here, which is the counter block is equal to the provider of that counter block class. What this does is it gives us access to the nearest provider of the counter block in our widget tree. If any values change, they'll trigger a state rebuild and give us the new counter value, or rather the new counter block value. And then of course we're listening to the counter here inside of the text. But right now there isn't any counter block inside of our widget tree. So this wouldn't work because we have no provider. We've got no change notifier at this point. So what we need to do is head over to main.dart, and we'll simply remove everything inside of main.dart. We'll make a new class of my app, and that's going to extend a stateless widget. We will override the build method once more, and we want to return a material app. The home page is going to be equal to the counter page. We will need to import that. And once we save the file, you'll see that we can't find the correct provider counter block above this counter page widget. So this goes exactly into how I said before. So inside of the counter page, it's going to look up in the widget tree, and it's going to look for a change notifier. It's going to look for something it can get the value of. So let's create a listener. And that's going to return, instead of returning a material app, we're going to return a new widget, and that widget's going to be a change notifier provider. That comes from provider.dart, so we'll need to provide that, or rather import that. And then at the same time, we'll need to set this equal to the counter block. So let's import the counter block. And then we want to say .value, and the notifier can be set to the counter block. So what does this do? It listens to the notifier and exposes it to all of the change notifier providers' descendants. So the notifier is this counter block. That means anytime it changes, we'll be notified of that inside of our provider, because we're getting the nearest provider inside of our counter page. So what if we wanted multiple providers? Because this is going to be a problem if we at the moment only have one block, but if we had multiple blocks, how would this change? Well, instead what we do is wrap this with what's known as a MultiProvider, and the child is no longer going to be this change notifier provider, but we will need to copy that out like so. The child can still be our material app, but we'll now need to have a providers and set the providers inside of an array. And this would give us the ability now to, of course, register multiple providers inside of our application. Right now we simply have the counter block, but you can imagine having something like an authentication block and much more. So this is good. We see 0 on screen. If we headed over to our counter block and we put this to be 10, we then see 10 instantly because this updates based on the value. We can also change the style of this to have a font size of 62 just to make this a little larger. So right now, not exactly that interesting. We can't currently put this up or down, so we need to add some interactivity. Just to make this more interesting for you so you can understand how this works for multiple widgets, we can go ahead and create what's known as a widgets directory. And inside of the widgets, we might have an increment.dart and a decrement.dart. I'm just going to copy the increment and decrement from the article over at developer.school because it's super simple. we'll start with the increment button, and we can see that we have this provider of our counter block once again. And because we have access to that counter block provider, we have access to all of the functions on that block. And we'll need to now create in a moment an increment function. So save that, go ahead over to the decrement, and I want you to paste in, or rather write this once again. It's simply a decrement button. This time it has a remove, i.e. remove 1, but this time on the unpressed, we're calling the decrement function. Inside of our counter block, we now can create 2 more functions, increment and decrement. The first one will of course be counter plus plus. The decrement will be counter minus minus. Then we can of course save the file. We can then head over to our counter.dart, and instead of simply just displaying this on screen, I'm going to paste in a column which is centered, and it has our increment button and decrement button. You'll have to, of course, import this like so. So then when we hit add, nothing happens. And why is that? Well, that's because inside of our increment and decrement, we aren't notifying the listeners of any change. So let's hit notify listeners once more. And then when we hit add and remove, the counter updates. And while that's fine and it works, the problem with this is that we're updating this counter while we have a setter. So what we actually want to do at that moment is use the counter setter and set the counter equal to minus and plus, like so. And now we don't have to notify the listeners inside of these 2 functions. We can simply click add and simply click remove. So as you can see, you aren't simply limited to calling the notify listeners inside of our increment and decrement functions. So that's been how to implement the business logic component, i.e. the block component inside of your Flutter applications using the provider library. I'm sure this is definitely over 5 minutes, but I hope that this has given you an understanding of how the block pattern and the provider sort of works together to provide updates across your application. It doesn't matter what widget you're using the context from. If you'd like to see more videos like this, let me know inside of the comments section below, and of course hit that subscribe button and the notification bell to stay updated. Until next time, thanks a lot for watching, I'll see you soon.